Broken churches, broken nation, evangelicals, and slavery. One of the reform movements in the North born out of the Second Great Awakening was the abolition movement, or the movement to end slavery. By mid-century, many Northerners began to link the future of the faith as well as the future of the country with end to slavery. The story is quite different in the South. The revival tradition eventually linked with social conservatism. Hurt by abolitionist attacks from the North, Southern Protestants, who once remained evasive on the subject, now came to defend the institution. The sectional conflict over slavery manifested itself in the theology of Protestant denominations, causing them to split. One of the arguments used by Southerners to defend slavery involved an economic interpretation. The free labor argument involved ministers producing religious pro-slavery tracts and sermons. They argued that slaves were free laborers. Some ministers even argued for reforms to slaveholding laws and customs, giving more rights and responsibility to slaves, making them morally responsible individuals. Ministers maintained that slaves labored voluntarily. Evangelicals use the Bible to justify their definition of voluntary labor. Although blacks do not have self-ownership by a legal definition, the Bible, considered the supreme law of the land, overruled any law made by man. Furthermore, they argued that the master was not the correct term, since a master did as much physical labor as a slave. The better term would be chief director. Free labor proponents argued slaves received biblical wages as they were under the protection of a biblical contract. Southern evangelicals argued that God provided slaves with food and clothing in exchange for their labor. Moreover, many conservative evangelicals argued that slavery represented the economic wave of the future, and soon the rest of the nation's labor practices would come to look more like the South's. Common Bible verses used for the free labor argument include the Adamic obligation to labor, Ecclesiastes 6:7, Luke 10:7, and Thessalonians 3:10. While the South was perpetuating a free labor argument, the North became deeply entrenched in social reform, and anti-slavery cause became a part of this larger humanitarian movement. William Lloyd Garrison, founder of the Liberator and a staunch abolitionist, was motivated by Puritan conscience and a Quaker upbringing. Charles Finney and Theodore Weld represented a more gentle spirit in the abolition movement. Their use of the pulpit and platform was to win more converts than the pamphlets and newspapers of Garrison and his radical friends. Finney was converted by an abolitionist, Reverend George Gale. Finney kept the revival message at the forefront and abolition second. In 1834, while pastor of the Second Free Presbyterian Church in New York, Finney found it necessary to write a series of lectures and revivals of religion. He could not refrain from dealing with the absorbing topic of slavery. Revivals, the author declared, were hindered when ministers and churches took wrong ground in regard to any question involving human rights. Slavery, for instance, was a subject upon which churches could not be silent without guilt. Theodore Weld, converted under Charles Finney, used the techniques of revivalism to convert sinners and abolish slavery. Weld, however, would go further than Finney and put more of an emphasis on abolition and less of an emphasis on converting sinners. Even the formation of the American Colonization Society was made possible by the spirit created by the Second Great Awakening. Not only were members of the societies evangelicals, but also were the workers. More of the anti-slavery lecturers, agents, and laborers were ministers of all denominations than any of the other professions of men. In Both Pray to the Same God, Robert Miller argues that the debate over the Bible and slavery was much a battle over how to interpret the Bible as it was about what the Bible said. Furthermore, the interpretation of the Bible and the question of slavery represented a theological crisis for America at the time of the Civil War. By the 1830s, theologians on both sides developed arguments that followed the canons of biblical literalism and the habit of forming proof texts. Both sides used arguments beginning with the Old Testament. One prominent argument was the curse of Cain. Pro-slavery used the curse of Canaan, saying that Africans were Cain's offspring. Abolitionists argued that Cain's offspring, the Canaanites, suffered the consequences of the curse when they lost their land to the armies of Joshua. Another prominent argument is centered around Abraham. Pro-slavery argued that Abraham was a friend of God and other patriarchs who owned slaves. Abolitionists, however, argued that the patriarchs also practiced things such as divorce and polygamy, which were no examples for Christians. New Testament arguments included the Golden Rule, and Paul's letter to Philemon to remit a slave to his master forever. The Baptist minister Richard Fuller argued that slavery was everywhere in the first century, and if Jesus considered it sinful, he would have challenged it. For abolitionists, Jesus' silence meant that he taught biblical principles that undermine all the oppression, including slavery. One of the most prominent debates that took place over the slavery question was the Fuller-Wayland debate. In November 1844, the Christian Reflector, a newspaper in Boston, invited South Carolina's Richard Fuller to a debate to argue that slavery was not a moral evil. There were 5 major themes to the Fuller-Wayland debate. The first was that the morality of slavery and the sin of slaveholding, the biblical arguments from the Old and New Testaments, the abolitionist movement, emancipation and slavery's future in America, and God's providence in the history of slavery in the United States. Fuller argued that slavery was not a moral evil. Wayland, however, made a distinction between 2 types of moral evils, allowing him to condemn slavery yet preserve judgment for individual Christians who own slaves. The slavery debate and biblical interpretation came to a head in the 1830s and 1840s as the 3 main Protestant denominations, Methodist, Baptist, and Presbyterian, began to experience internal tension. For the Methodist Church, for most of its history of the early nation, they were apolitical, not focusing much on politics, focusing on their belief that they were citizens of Zion, and that their involvement in this world didn't matter. They had a higher cause. Methodists joined with other Protestant evangelicals in a coalition driven not just by political calculation, but by a burning sense of Christian duty and moral indignation. The main issue in the Methodist split was the holding of slaves by bishops. At first, the language of Baptists, in keeping with the language of the entire South, was sometimes that of apology for the slavery system, then tacit acknowledgement. Finally, a defense on scriptural grounds was made. In 1845, the Baptists fell apart over the issue of missionaries holding slaves. Upset over the Triennial Convention's judgment against slavery, Southern Baptist churches met in Georgia and formed what would become the Southern Baptist Convention. The Presbyterian Church split in 1837 for mainly theological and ecclesiastical reasons, but the underlying issue was ultimately slavery. The Old School Presbyterians held that slavery was a secular topic and should not be addressed by the church. The New School, however, wanted the church to act more vigilantly to end slavery and other social issues. The Old School drew most of their support from the South, whereas the New School drew most of their support from the North. The issue of slavery split the mainline Protestant denominations in 2, just as the nation was beginning to form 2 distinct cultures, divided by the North and South. The Christian view of slavery for both sides was rooted in the Bible. As Abraham Lincoln said in his second inaugural address, both sides read the same Bible, both sides pray to the same God. The issue of slavery created a theological division within the church and a division within the nation.